On the 12th of May, 1996, Doug Hansen stood at an altitude of 8,700 meters. His oxygen tank was empty. The air temperature was minus 41 degrees Celsius. Wind struck his face at a speed of 130 kilometers per hour. He could not move, could not scream, could not even turn his head. His expedition leader, Rob Hall, said one phrase over the radio to base camp: "Please tell my wife that I love her." Both of them would die on this mountain. But their death is only 25 points on the horror scale, and the maximum is 150. Stay until the end to find out which death on Everest reaches that mark. I warn you, this material is not for the faint of heart. Everest kills slowly. That is its chief cruelty. It is not an explosion, not a plane crash, not a car accident. It is hours and days of agony at an altitude where the human body destroys itself, where the brain swells and can no longer distinguish reality from delirium, where the blood thickens so much that the heart cannot pump it, where frostbitten fingers turn black and fall off while you are still alive. Every year, bodies remain on the slopes of this mountain. More than 300 corpses lie there right now. Some of them have become landmarks on the route. Climbers walk past frozen dead and use them as road signs. That is what Everest looks like. We will start at 25 points and climb the horror scale together with each new story. Each subsequent death is more terrifying than the last. Each subsequent victim suffered longer, more painfully, more hopelessly. The first story, 1924, the northeast ridge of Everest. Two British climbers, George Mallory and Andrew Irvine. Mallory was 37 years old. Irvine was 22. On the 8th of June, they set out from camp at an altitude of 8,170 meters. The last person to see them alive was geologist Noel Odell. He stood below and looked through binoculars. He saw two tiny figures on the ridge at approximately 8,600 meters. Then clouds closed over everything. No one ever saw them again. 75 years. That is how long it took before Mallory's body was found. On the 1st of May, 1999, a search expedition discovered him at an altitude of 8,155 meters. The body lay face down, arms spread to the sides, fingers clutching the rocky slope. The rope around his waist was broken. That means one thing: he fell. The rope connected him to Irvine, and it snapped during the fall, or one of them cut it to avoid dragging his partner down. Mallory's body was disturbingly well preserved. The skin had turned white and hardened like parchment. The muscles had dried out. The clothing had partially decayed. He wore a wool sweater, a cotton jacket, and thin leather boots. No down, no Gore-Tex. 1924. The equipment was primitive. These men were heading to an altitude of nearly 9,000 meters in clothing that today no one would even wear on a winter walk. What exactly happened remains unknown to this day, but the reconstruction paints a terrifying picture. Mallory most likely slipped on an icy slope. The angle of incline at that spot is approximately 40 degrees. During the fall, he sustained a fracture of his right leg. This was evident from the position of the body. The shin bone was broken. He tried to break. The nails on his hands were scraped down to the flesh, fingers bent like claws. He clawed at the rocks with bare hands in minus 35-degree cold, and he stopped. But he could not stand up. This is what it means to die of hypothermia on Everest. First, the body begins to shiver. This is a defensive reaction. Muscles contract, trying to generate heat. But at an altitude of 8,000 meters, the oxygen in the air is only a third of normal. The muscles do not receive enough oxygen to function. The shivering stops. Body temperature drops below 35 degrees Celsius. Confusion sets in. The person stops understanding where they are. Sometimes people begin to undress. This is called paradoxical undressing. The brain receives a false signal of heat. On Mallory's body, some clothing had been removed. Possibly in the final minutes of his life, he pulled off his own jacket, thinking he was hot, at minus 35 degrees. Then blood drains from the extremities to the body's core. The fingers of the hands and feet lose sensation. Then they turn black. Then, literally, they die. The heartbeat slows to 30 beats per minute, then to 20, then to 10. Consciousness fades, but not immediately. That is the most horrifying part. A person in a state of severe hypothermia can remain conscious for another hour or two, lying motionless, feeling the body die piece by piece. Mallory probably spent between 40 minutes and 2 hours in this state, alone on the slope with a broken leg, with no way to call for help. Irvin's body has never been found. He was 22 years old. Somewhere on Everest lies a 22-year-old young man frozen 100 years ago, and no one knows exactly where. On the horror scale, this is 25 points. A quick fall, a fracture, a relatively brief agony from the cold. Terrifying, but this is only the beginning. And yet, there exists a death far more agonizing, because Mallory at least lost consciousness. And the next person on our list did not. The 10th of May, 1996, Everest, the south current altitude, 7,920 meters. This is the date that entered the history of mountaineering as the deadliest day on the mountain in the entire 20th century. 8 people died that day. But one death stands apart. Yasuko Namba, 47 years old, Japanese, an office worker from Tokyo. She was not a professional climber. She was a client of Scott Fisher's commercial expedition, the company Mountain Madness. She paid $65,000 for the right to climb to the top of the world, and she made it. On the 10th of May at around 4 in the afternoon, Yasuko Namba stood on the summit of Everest. She became the oldest Japanese woman to conquer this mountain. She wept with joy, and within 12 hours she would be dead. The descent began late, too late. The classic Everest rule: if you are not on the summit by 2 in the afternoon, turn around. Yasuko reached the summit at 4. That meant the descent through the most dangerous section, the death zone above 8,000 meters, fell during the evening and night. And on the night of the 10th of May, a storm struck Everest. Wind speeds reached 160 kilometers per hour. Visibility dropped to 0. The temperature with wind chill, minus 73 degrees Celsius, minus 73. At that temperature, exposed skin suffers frostbite in 30 seconds. Yasuko was walking in a group of several climbers. They got lost. At an altitude of 7,900 meters, in complete darkness with 0 visibility, they lost the trail. The group huddled together and lay down on the snow. They could not walk. The wind knocked them off their feet. They could not see. Snow clogged their goggles and eyes. They could not breathe. The wind tore the air from their lungs. They lay like that all night, about 6 or 7 hours, on an exposed slope at minus 73. In the morning, when the storm subsided slightly, guide Anatoly Bukreev reached them. He found several people. Some he managed to lift and lead to the tents. But when he approached Yasuko Namba, she lay unconscious. Her face was covered with a crust of ice. Her gloves had been torn off by the wind. Her hands were black, frostbitten to the bone. Bukreev checked her pulse. There was a pulse, barely perceptible, about 12 beats per minute. She was alive. But Bukreev made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He decided she was beyond saving. He left her and carried another climber who, in his judgment, had a chance. Yasuko Namba died on that slope. Alone. Conscious or not, no one knows. Her body was found later. She lay in the fetal position, curled up like a child, hands pressed to her chest, her face a mask of ice. Here is what makes this death especially terrifying. It lasted hours, 6, 7, perhaps 8 hours on an exposed slope in unimaginable cold. The body died gradually, first the fingers, then the hands, then the feet, then the forearms. 4th-degree frostbite is when it is not the skin that freezes, but the bone. Tissues crystallize. Cells are torn apart from within by ice crystals. The pain of 4th-degree frostbite is one of the most intense a human being can experience. And then the pain disappears, because the nerves are dead, and you lie there feeling the zone of numbness creep higher and higher up your body. The hands no longer hurt, they are dead. The legs do not hurt, they are dead. The abdomen still feels the cold. Then it stops. Yasuko Namba paid $65,000 for this death. On the horror scale, 45 points. Prolonged agony, extreme cold, awareness of what was happening. But she was at least unconscious in the final hours. The next person on our list was conscious until the very end. However, you do not need to be caught in a storm for Everest to kill you. Sometimes the mountain kills in clear weather, with good visibility before the eyes of dozens of people, and no one helps. That is what is truly terrifying. The 15th of May, 2006, the North Ridge of Everest, altitude 8,600 meters. David Sharp, 34 years old, British, an engineer from Bristol, a quiet, reserved person. He came to Everest alone, without a guide, without a support team. He paid only $7,500 for a spot in a budget expedition that provided only base camp and a climbing permit. No Sherpas on the road, no oxygen depots, no insurance. On the 14th of May, Sharp set out for the summit push. He climbed at night, in the dark, alone. At approximately 1 in the morning on the 15th of May, he reached the summit, or was very close to it. But on the descent, his oxygen tank ran out. At an altitude of 8,600 meters, near the spot climbers call the first step, David Sharp sat down on a rock and never stood up again. Here is what happens to a person without oxygen at an altitude of 8,600 meters. The partial pressure of oxygen there is approximately a third of normal. The brain begins to swell. This is called high-altitude cerebral edema. Fluid accumulates inside the skull, pressing on the brain tissue. The first symptom is a savage headache, not an ordinary headache, but one as if the skull were being squeezed in a vice. Then comes loss of coordination. The person cannot walk straight, cannot zip a zipper, cannot string two words together. Then come hallucinations. People see things that are not there. They talk to the dead. They laugh for no reason. They cry. Then comes coma and death. David Sharp did not fall into a coma right away. He sat by the rock, leaned against the stone, and remained conscious. More than 40 climbers passed him. 40 people. Some of them later recounted stories. Yes, they saw a person sitting by the rock. Some thought he was resting. Some understood he was dying. But no one stopped for long. One climber, Mark Inglis, a New Zealander without both legs, ascending on prosthetics, later admitted that his group walked past Sharp. They saw that he was alive. They saw that he could not move. They gave him oxygen, one tank, and continued on toward the summit. David Sharp spent approximately 18 hours on that rock. 18 hours. He was slowly freezing and slowly suffocating at the same time. His brain was swelling. His lungs were filling with fluid. This is high-altitude pulmonary edema, when with every breath you hear gurgling in your own chest. You are drowning in your own fluid at an altitude of 9 kilometers, in dry, icy air. The camera of one of the passing climbers captured Sharp. In the footage, you can see he is still moving. Slowly, barely perceptibly turning his head, his hands rest on his knees. He is alive, and he understands that people are walking past, and that no one will stop. By the evening of the 15th of May, David Sharp was dead. His body remains sitting by that rock. It sits there to this day. Climbers ascending the North Ridge pass him every season. Some newcomers ask, who is that person by the rock? They are told, that is David Sharp. Pay no attention, keep going. A terrible detail of this story, Sharp had a radio, but he did not call for help. Either he could not buy him, his fingers no longer obeyed him, or he did not want to. Or his brain, ravaged by edema, no longer understood that the radio could save his life. We do not know. We will never know. On the horror scale, 65 points, 18 hours of agony, full consciousness in the first hours, 40 people walk past, and absolute solitude at the end. And yet this is not the limit, because David Sharp at least sat motionless. His body was not moving, the pain from frostbite subsided over time, and his brain, swollen and dying, at some point simply shut down. But the next story is about a person who could not stop moving, who was falling, slowly, agonizingly for hours, and remained alive. On the 11th of May, 1996, yes, that very same cursed season, Rob Hall, a New Zealand guide, owner of the company Adventure Consultants, became stranded at an altitude of 8,730 meters. The south summit of Everest. He could not descend. And the reason he could not descend makes this story one of the most heartbreaking in the history of mountaineering. Rob Hall stayed up high because of his client, Doug Hansen. Hansen, 46 years old, a postal worker from Seattle, was climbing Everest for the second time. The first time, a year earlier, Hall had turned him around just 100 meters from the summit. It was too late. The weather was deteriorating. Hansen was devastated. He saved money for another year, went into debt, and returned. And this time, Hall did not turn him back. They reached the summit at around 4 in the afternoon, 2 hours past the absolute deadline. On the descent, Hansen became exhausted. His oxygen ran out. He could not walk. Hall could have abandoned him and descended on his own. But he did not abandon him. That night on the south summit lasted an eternity. The temperature was minus 45 degrees. Wind, 120 kilometers per hour. Hall and Hansen sat on the exposed ridge with no shelter. Hansen died first, presumably around midnight. Hall was left alone, with the dead body of his client, at an altitude where rescue was impossible. On the morning of the 16th of May, 30 hours after setting out for the summit, Hall came on the radio. His voice was calm, too calm. He asked to be connected to his wife. Jan Arnold, his wife, was in New Zealand. She was pregnant, in her 7th month. The connection was established through the satellite phone at base camp. The conversation lasted 3 minutes. Hall told her, "Do not worry." She asked, "How are you?" He answered, "I am fine." It was a lie. His hands were frostbitten to such a degree that he could not hold the radio. He clamped it between his knees. His legs would not move. His face was covered in ice. The last words he said to his wife were, "I love you. Sleep well, my darling. Please do not worry too much." After that, the connection was lost. Rob Hall died sometime during the next several hours. His body was found a few days later. He lay in a sleeping bag, curled on his side, hands black as coal, face unrecognizable. His daughter Sarah was born 2 months later. She never saw her father. On the horror scale, 85 points, 30 hours at an altitude of nearly 9,000 meters. Full awareness of the situation, Hall was one of the most experienced climbers in the world. He knew exactly that he was dying. He knew that help would not come. He knew that his wife was hearing his last words, and he chose to stay with a client he could have abandoned. This is not simply death. This is a sentence he passed on himself. But even 30 hours is not the maximum, because Everest is capable of stretching dying out over days. And the next story is precisely about that, about a person who died before the eyes of the entire world. Live on air on the 20th of May, 2006, the same season when David Sharp perished, Lincoln Hall was on the North Ridge of Everest. An Australian, 50 years old, an experienced climber with 30 years of experience. He summited and began his descent. At an altitude of 8,700 meters, he fell ill. High-altitude cerebral edema. He began to hallucinate, tear off his clothing, talk to invisible people. 2 Sherpas tried to bring him down. For 4 hours, they dragged him along the ridge. But Hall weighed 90 kilograms, and at that altitude, every step is a feat even for a healthy person. The Sherpas were exhausted. They contacted base camp and reported, "Lincoln Hall is dead." The expedition leader, Alex Abramov, gave the order, "Leave the body and descend." But Lincoln Hall was not dead. He was unconscious, in a coma, with a swollen brain and a freezing body. But his heart was beating. And on the morning of the 21st of May, something incredible happened. A group of climbers heading for the summit stumbled upon him. He was sitting on the edge of a precipice. His down jacket was unzipped. His gloves were off. His hands were bare, frostbitten, black. And he was alive. He was talking. Incoherently, confusedly, but talking. He said, "Imagine the view from here." He was rescued. 4 climbers from another expedition gave up their summit attempt and spent the entire day bringing Hall down. He survived. He lost the tips of all his fingers on both hands and feet. He underwent several surgeries, but he survived. This story could have been a story of a miracle, but there is a detail that turns it into a nightmare. On that night when the Sherpas declared him dead and left, Lincoln Hall spent approximately 12 hours alone on the ridge, at a temperature of minus 40 degrees, without gloves, without oxygen, in a state of cerebral edema, meaning with a monstrous headache and hallucinations. He later recounted that he saw 2 people sitting beside him. He talked to them all night. They did not exist. But the most terrifying thing is that he remembered. He remembered the Sherpas leaving. He remembered being left alone. He remembered the darkness, the cold, and the voices in his head. He remembered how his fingers stopped feeling and then stopped moving. He remembered everything. Lincoln Hall died 6 years later, in 2012 from mesothelioma. But those 12 hours on the ridge of Everest, he called the most terrifying experience of his life. Worse than cancer, worse than chemotherapy, worse than everything. On the horror scale, 110 points. 12 hours of absolute solitude at a lethal altitude. Hallucinations, frostbite to the bone, full awareness in those moments when the brain briefly cleared that you had been left to die, and the memory of all of it for the rest of your life. But this is not the maximum. Lincoln Hall survived, and the next person did not. And his death lasted not 12 hours. It lasted 3 days. Everest is the only place on Earth where you can die before the eyes of dozens of people, and no one can help you. Not because they do not want to, but because, physically, they cannot. At altitudes above 8,000 meters, the human body deteriorates with every hour. A rescuer who stops to help risks dying himself. And this is not a metaphor. This is a literal medical fact. Every hour above 8,000 meters means irreversible damage to the brain, lungs, and heart. Every hour is a step toward death. And that is why the next story is the most terrifying on this mountain. 2009. The Northeast Ridge. Altitude, 8,600 meters. The very same spot where 3 years earlier David Sharp had died. A cursed place. There is no other way to put it. On the 20th of May, Indian climber Srinivas Dutta, 40 years old, a programmer from Bangalore, began his descent from the summit. He had summited successfully, taken a photograph at the top, unfurled the flag of India. Everything was going according to plan. But on the descent, at an altitude of 8,600 meters, his legs gave out. They simply stopped working. The muscles, depleted by inhuman exertion and oxygen starvation, could no longer contract. Srinivas sat down on the snow. His Sherpa, Lakpa, tried to lift him. He could not. Srinivas weighed approximately 85 kilograms. At an altitude of 8,600 meters, lifting 85 kilograms is the same as lifting 300 at sea level. Lakpa called for help on the radio. Base camp responded, "We will send people." Wait, help did not come. For 6 hours, Lakpa sat beside Srinivas. Then Lakpa ran out of oxygen. He had to choose, stay and die alongside his client, or descend and survive. He descended. Srinivas was left alone. It was night. The temperature was minus 42 degrees. The wind was 80 kilometers per hour. He was conscious. He was calling on a satellite phone. He was calling his wife in Bangalore. He told her, "I am cold. Send someone, please." His wife called base camp. Base camp contacted other expeditions. Everyone answered the same thing. At that altitude, at night, in that weather, rescue is impossible. We will try in the morning. On the morning of May 21st, Srinivas was still alive. He called his wife again. His voice was weak, hoarse, barely audible. He said, "I cannot feel my legs. I cannot feel my arms, but I am alive. Please tell them to come." A group of 4 Sherpas set out from camp at an altitude of 7,700 meters. They were heading toward him. The journey took about 6 hours. When they reached Srinivas, he was still alive. But he could not move at all. His hands and feet were frostbitten to the 4th degree. Black, hard as wood. His face was covered with a crust of ice. His eyes were open, but one eye had gone completely blind from corneal frostbite. The Sherpas tried to bring him down. They strapped him to improvised stretchers made of ropes and began the descent. But on a steep section below the first step, an angle of about 50 degrees, the stretchers flipped over. Srinivas fell. He tumbled about 30 meters and became lodged on a rocky ledge. The Sherpas descended to him. He was alive. He looked at them with his one seeing eye and moved his lips. He was trying to say something, but there was no voice. His vocal cords, frostbitten from breathing in the icy air, were not working. The Sherpas were exhausted. 2 of them began showing symptoms of high-altitude edema. They made the decision to descend for a new rescue party. They left Srinivas an oxygen canister and departed. The second night, Srinivas spent a second night on Everest at an altitude of 8,500 meters, alone, with a frostbitten body, blind in one eye, without a voice, with an oxygen canister he could not open. His fingers were dead. On the morning of May 22nd, he did not answer the radio call. His body was found later. He lay on the rocky ledge, face up with open eyes. The oxygen canister lay beside him, untouched. The mask was on his face, but the valve was closed. He had not been able to open it. 3 days. Srinivas Datta died over the course of 3 days. About 60 hours from the moment his legs gave out to the moment of death. 60 hours at temperatures ranging from -35 to -45 degrees, with progressive frostbite that climbed from his fingers toward his torso, with cerebral edema that caused monstrous headaches and hallucinations, with pulmonary edema that made him choke on his own fluid with every breath, and with a phone on which he called his wife and begged for help that could not come. I cannot play you the recordings of his calls, but they exist. His wife kept them. And once she told journalists, "I heard my husband die. 2 days. I heard his every breath. And there was nothing I could do on the scale of horror. 130 points. 3 days of agony. Full consciousness for the first 2 days. Contact with family. He knew his wife could hear him. He knew that help was trying to come. And he knew it would not make it in time. This is not simply death. This is torture by hope. But the most terrifying, it is not 150 points. We have not yet reached the maximum, because there is one death on Everest that surpasses all the rest. Not in duration, though it too was long, not in pain, though the pain was monstrous, but in the fact that the victim saw rescue, reached out a hand toward it, and could not reach. But first, you need to understand one thing about the death zone. Above 8,000 meters, the human body cannot exist. This is not a figure of speech. This is physiology. At this altitude, the body consumes more energy than it can produce. Muscles break down. The body literally devours itself, breaking down muscle protein for calories. The blood thickens. The number of red blood cells increases to carry more oxygen, but the blood becomes viscous, like jelly. The heart works at its limit, trying to pump this thick mass. The brain swells from lack of oxygen. The lungs fill with fluid. The kidneys begin to fail. All of this happens simultaneously, and all of it is irreversible past a certain threshold. This is why on Everest you cannot rescue a person who cannot walk on their own. A helicopter cannot climb above 7,800 meters. The air is too thin for the rotors to function. Stretchers on a steep, icy slope are suicide for rescuers. The only way to descend is on your own feet. If your legs do not work, you are dead. This is a sentence that Everest hands down without the right of appeal. And now, the final story, 150 points, the maximum of the scale, 1996. Yes, that year again. Scott Fisher, 40 years old, American, one of the most famous mountaineers in the world, owner of the company Mountain Madness, tall, handsome, incredibly strong. He could carry a 60-kilogram backpack at an altitude of 7,000 meters. He was considered a Superman. His clients adored him. His competitors respected him. He seemed invincible. On May 10th, Fisher led his clients to the summit, but that day he was ill. No one knows exactly what was wrong with him. Presumably altitude sickness, aggravated by an intestinal infection. He climbed slowly, too slowly. His senior guide, the Kazakhstani Anatoly Bukreev, went ahead with the clients. Fisher fell behind. He reached the summit at around 3:30 in the afternoon. Late, fatally late. On the descent, at an altitude of 8,300 meters, he collapsed. He simply fell onto the snow and could not get up. His body had failed. His muscles stopped working. His breathing became shallow, 12 breaths per minute instead of the normal 20. The Sherpa Lopsang Jangbu, who was nearby, tried to carry him. Lopsang himself was at his limit. He had been hauling a short rope with a client all day, but he tried. He dragged Fisher downward for about an hour. Then his strength gave out. Lopsang clipped Fisher to a fixed rope on the slope and went for help. Fisher was left at an altitude of 8,300 meters, alone. A storm was beginning, that very storm that would kill Yasuko Namba and Doug Hansen. The wind was building. The temperature was dropping. Several hours later, Bukreev climbed up to Fisher, alone without oxygen, in the storm, at night. It was one of the most heroic ascents in the history of mountaineering. Bukreev found Fisher in the darkness, by touch, by the sound of his breathing. Fisher was alive, but he could not move. At all. His body was like a rag doll. Bukreev tried to lift him. He could not. Fisher weighed about 90 kilograms. At an altitude of 8,300 meters, in a storm, with winds of 140 kilometers per hour, one person cannot carry another. And here is the moment that makes this death the maximum on the scale. Bukreev was standing right there. Rescue was right there. One of the best mountaineers in the world stood 1 meter from Fisher and could not save him. Fisher saw him. Fisher knew it was Bukreev. Fisher knew that Bukreev had come for him. And Fisher knew, by Bukreev's eyes, by his silence, by the way he lowered his hands, that this was the end. Bukreev gave Fisher oxygen, wrapped him in an extra jacket, and went down, to save those who could still be saved. He left his friend and boss to die on the slope, because there was no other choice. Scott Fisher died throughout the night, alone on an open slope. The storm raged around him. Snow buried his body, wind tore at his clothing. The temperature with wind chill, minus 70 degrees. Here is what was happening to his body during those hours. First, the kidneys failed. They stopped filtering the blood, and toxins began accumulating in the body. This causes nausea, vomiting, confusion. Then the cerebral edema intensified. The pressure inside the skull rose so much that small blood vessels began to burst. Microstrokes. Dozens, hundreds of microstrokes, each one shutting down a tiny area of the brain. First, abstract thinking shuts down. Then speech. Then vision. Then hearing. But the pain receptors, they shut down last. The body feels pain until the very end. Frostbite by this point had reached the torso. Not just the fingers, not just the hands and feet. The torso was freezing. Ice crystals formed in the intercellular spaces of the abdominal and chest tissues. Each crystal, like a tiny blade, tearing through the cell membrane. Billions of cells dying simultaneously, and each one sending a pain signal. Fisher's heart most likely stopped between 3 and 5 in the morning on May 11th. By that point, he had been on the slope for about 12 hours. But his agony had begun much earlier, still on the descent, when his body began to fail. Total time of suffering, about 20 hours. His body was found 2 days later. He lay on his back, face turned toward the sky, eyes open, mouth open, a final breath that never became an exhale. Snow had half buried him. His bright yellow jacket stuck out of the snow like a flag. Scott Fisher's body lies on Everest to this day, at an altitude of 8,300 meters. Climbers pass by him. Some stop, some do not. 150 points, the maximum of the scale. And here is why. Not because his death was the longest. Srinivas died over a longer period. Not because his pain was the most intense. Frostbite is the same everywhere. But because Scott Fisher saw his rescue. Bukreev was standing right there, 1 meter away. Reach out your hand, and you could touch him. But the hand did not work, and Bukreev could not carry him. Rescue was so close, and so infinitely far. This is the worst thing a dying person can experience. Not the absence of hope, but its presence. Hope that stands 1 meter from you and says, "Forgive me, I cannot." Anatoly Bukreev perished a year and a half later, in December of 1997, under an avalanche on Annapurna. Many believe he never forgave himself for that night on Everest, for leaving, for abandoning his friend. Everest is not evil, it is not cruel, it is simply big, and it does not care. It does not care how much you paid. It does not care what experience you have. It does not care whether someone loves you down below. It simply stands. 8,849 meters of rock, ice, and wind, and people come to it, and some do not return. Over 300 bodies lie on its slopes right now. 300 people who wanted to touch the sky. Some of them are visible from the trail. Some are buried under snow. Some, like David Sharp, sit by a rock as if resting, as if they are about to stand up and keep going. They will not stand up. Here is the question I want to ask you. If you knew all of this, every detail, every story, every call from a wife, every black frostbitten hand, would you still go? $65,000, 2 months of preparation, and a chance, small but real, of remaining there forever. Would you go? Write in the comments. I am genuinely curious. And if you had the nerve to listen all the way to this point, it means you are one of those who does not look away. Subscribe. Ahead are stories for which nerves of steel will come in even more handy.